Ever feel like the world's kind of like against you? Like
Yeah.
everything's just out to get you.
Oh, yeah.
Well, now just imagine living in a time when that feeling, that fear, is just like amplified tenfold.
Right.
When like a simple cough or a bad harvest could get you labeled a witch.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that's exactly the kind of atmosphere that we're diving into today.
Okay.
17th century England.
Yeah.
A period just totally gripped by fear and superstition, and of course the infamous Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins.
Right, right.
And to help us kind of navigate this dark chapter,
Yeah.
we're turning to a really incredible resource.
Oh, okay.
An interview with playwright Joanna Carrick,
Oh, okay.
who created a really fascinating play called The Ungodly.
Okay.
It dives deep into Hopkins' life and really tries to understand what could have led him down such a dark path.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah,
It's important to remember that Hopkins didn't just come out of nowhere.
right.
To understand him, we need to understand the world that he was living in, specifically the Puritan culture that dominated East Anglia at the time.
Now, Puritanism, for those who may need just a little bit of a refresher,
Okay.
was this strict religious movement that just permeated every single aspect of life.
Right.
So think of it as this constant awareness of sin,
Yeah.
right? This belief that the devil was literally lurking around every corner, influencing every misfortune.
Right. So every bad thing that happened is either because God is angry at you or the devil is messing with you.
Exactly.
And it's that mindset, that
Wow.
constant fear that really lays the groundwork for these witch hunts.
Yeah.
Because when you believe that every bad thing is a sign of God's wrath or the devil's work, you start looking for someone to blame.
Right. And we're not just talking about some like abstract anxieties here.
Yeah.
Life in the 17th century was brutal,
Oh, yeah.
hard, right?
Yeah.
Just imagine a time with very limited medical knowledge
Right.
where infant mortality rates are just tragically high.
Yeah.
And a failed harvest could very easily mean starvation for you and your family.
Right. In that context, the idea of witchcraft, it almost offered like a twisted sort of comfort. Like a way to make sense of all this chaos.
Right.
Instead of blaming God or just blaming fate in general,
Yeah.
you could point the finger at a neighbor, a woman on the fringes of society, someone who's different.
Someone to blame.
Yeah, and Carrick's play
Yeah.
really highlights this shift so well,
Okay.
showing how grief and desperation could so easily morph into suspicion and accusation.
Right.
Like, for example, she focuses on Hopkins' stepsister, Susan,
Okay.
who loses a child,
Oh.
and then she subsequently becomes convinced that witchcraft was to blame.
Wow. So using that to rationalize this terrible tragedy.
Exactly, and what's so fascinating is that Hopkins himself wasn't always a true believer in witchcraft.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in fact, early on, he was really skeptical of some of these more outlandish claims.
So what changed?
Well, it seems his personal experiences, particularly those that were influenced by Susan's deepening belief in witchcraft, they slowly started to erode his skepticism.
So almost like his worldview was being shaped by those around him.
Exactly. There's even an episode in the play where Hopkins' greyhound is spooked by something in the garden,
Okay.
and he immediately interprets this
As a demon.
as an encounter with like a demonic creature.
Wow. I mean, that sounds almost comical now,
Yeah.
but you can put yourself back then in that climate of just intense fear.
Right.
And it's easy to see how an incident like that could really push someone towards fanaticism.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just about like individual psychology.
Right.
The community also played a huge role in amplifying these fears.
Right. It's almost like this feedback loop of suspicion.
Exactly.
If your neighbor believes in witches and your pastor preaches about the devil's influence,
Yeah.
it's got to be harder and harder to resist that narrative.
Absolutely. And then you add in all the social and economic tensions of the time.
Right. You mentioned landlords earlier. Like,
Yes.
what role did they play in all this?
Well, there was growing resentment towards landlords,
Okay.
partly fueled by this Puritan crackdown on traditional customs.
Oh, wow.
So imagine the frustration of having your Christmas festivities banned.
Yeah.
Being told even like simple pleasures are sinful.
Right.
It just created this breeding ground for anger and resentment.
So when something bad happened, who better to blame
Right.
than the person who already seemed like the outsider?
Right.
Someone different, someone vulnerable.
Exactly.
Often that meant single women, the poor, or those who just didn't quite fit in.
Exactly. And once those accusations started flying, it was incredibly difficult to stop that momentum.
Wow.
People just craved that sense of order,
Right.
a way to explain the unexplainable.
Yeah.
And that's where Hopkins steps in,
Ah,
offering himself as the solution.
oh, so he's taking advantage of this climate.
Yes.
And that's where the story takes like a really dark turn, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He becomes this self-proclaimed witch finder general,
Right.
going from town to town, seeking out these supposed witches
Yeah.
and using increasingly brutal methods to extract confessions.
And one of the most heartbreaking cases, one that Carrick really focuses on in her play,
Okay.
is that of Rebecca West, a young woman who falls victim to all of Hopkins's tactics.
Let's unpack this a bit. Like, what exactly happened to Rebecca?
Well, she's imprisoned and subjected to these just horrific interrogations.
Okay.
Hopkins was notorious for using sleep deprivation,
Oh, wow.
among other methods,
Yeah.
to really break people down and force them to confess.
Right.
So you can imagine the psychological toll that this takes, how easily a vulnerable person could be coerced into saying anything
Right.
just to make it stop.
Just to end the torment.
Exactly, and to make matters even worse,
Yeah.
she ends up accusing her own mother of witchcraft
What?
just to try to save herself.
Wow, that's just heartbreaking.
It really speaks to the devastating power that Hopkins yielded, the way he manipulated people's fears and turned them against their own loved ones.
So what was driving him? Like, was this guy a true believer, a fanatic, or was there something more cynical going on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that Carrick really explores in her play, suggesting that the truth might be much more complicated than just a simple good versus evil narrative.
Right. It's never that simple, is it?
No, never.
It's hard to grasp the level of fear that must have been permeating society for someone like Hopkins to gain so much influence. I mean, what was he even using as proof of witchcraft?
Well, one of the more disturbing aspects of the witch hunts was this reliance on these so-called familiars.
Right, like the classic image of a witch with her black cat.
Exactly. But what's fascinating is that Carrick's play kind of suggests that these familiars were often just ordinary household pets,
Oh.
just viewed through this lens of fear and superstition.
So a playful kitten suddenly becomes a demonic imp.
Exactly.
It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic.
It really highlights how easily everyday occurrences could be twisted into proof of witchcraft.
Right.
Hopkins would encourage people to report any unusual animal behavior.
Mm.
And these reports, often fueled by imaginations already primed for the supernatural,
Yeah.
would then be used as evidence.
It really makes you think about how our own biases and preconceptions can shape our interpretation of the world around us.
Right.
Speaking of shaping perceptions, I found it interesting how Carrick emphasizes the role of darkness,
Okay.
the literal darkness of night, in fueling people's fears.
Yes. Remember, this is long before electricity.
Right.
The night was a truly different world, full of shadows and unknowns.
Yeah.
It's easy to see how, in that context, ordinary sounds and sights could take on a more sinister quality.
Right. Carrick even mentions an incident in the play where Hopkins claims to have seen a demonic creature in his garden at night.
Oh, wow.
It could have been any number of ordinary animals, but in that context, it's easy to see how his mind might jump to witchcraft. Yeah. And this brings us back to the question of Hopkins' true motivations.
Okay.
While he may have genuinely believed in the reality of witchcraft, it's also clear that he benefited from the fear and chaos he was helping to create.
Right.
He basically became a celebrity, didn't he?
Indeed. People flocked to see his pronouncements, to witness his interrogations.
Yeah.
And of course, with that notoriety came financial rewards. Hopkins charged handsomely for his services.
Oh, wow.
Which further muddies the waters when we try to assess his sincerity.
Right. It's a pattern we've seen throughout history, unfortunately. Someone exploits a crisis for personal gain,
Yeah.
often leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. And in this case, the most heartbreaking devastation is exemplified in Rebecca West's story.
Absolutely. Her case is so haunting because it reveals the psychological manipulation at play.
Right.
Hopkins was a master at breaking people down,
Yeah.
leading them to confess to acts they never committed.
And to accuse their loved ones, no less.
Right.
It's hard to fathom the sense of betrayal and despair that must have created.
This is where Carrick's play is so insightful.
Right.
It forces us to confront the humanity of everyone involved,
Yeah.
even those who committed terrible acts.
Mm-hmm.
We see Hopkins as a product of his time,
Right.
shaped by a culture steeped in fear and religious extremism.
But it also prompts us to consider our own potential for such behavior.
Right.
Haven't we all at some point bought into narratives that later proved to be false?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe scapegoated others to alleviate our own anxieties.
It's an uncomfortable truth, but an essential one to acknowledge.
Right.
By understanding the past, we can hopefully avoid repeating those mistakes.
So what are the key takeaways from all of this? What can we learn from the story of the Witchfinder General that might help us navigate our own complex world?
Well, for me, it's a stark reminder of how quickly fear and prejudice can spiral out of control,
Yeah.
leading to unimaginable cruelty.
And how those in positions of power can exploit those fears for their own ends.
Exactly. It's a cautionary tale that resonates deeply, even centuries later. But I also think there's a message of hope here.
Okay.
By shining a light on these dark chapters of history, we can learn from them
Right.
and work towards creating a more just and compassionate society, one where reason and empathy prevail over fear and ignorance.
It's almost dizzying to think about, like,
Yeah.
how easily an entire community could succumb to that level of paranoia and fear.
Right.
It makes you wonder if we were just, like, transported back to 17th century East Anglia.
Yeah.
How would we react?
Right.
Would we get swept up in the hysteria?
Yeah.
Or would we have the courage to kind of stand against it?
It's a thought-provoking question, isn't it? And it speaks to how relevant this story still is today.
Right.
The witch hunts might be a distant memory, but the forces that fueled them,
Yeah.
that fear, the ignorance, the desire for easy answers, all of that is still very much present in our world.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found so compelling about Carrick's play.
Okay.
It's not just a historical drama. It's like a reflection on human nature, you know?
Yeah.
A warning against the dangers of unchecked extremism.
Right.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to question our own beliefs,
Yeah.
to challenge injustice, and to protect the vulnerable.
And to cultivate empathy.
Yes.
To really try to understand the perspectives of those who are different from us, even those we might disagree with.
Right.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of demonizing the other.
Oh,
to
yeah.
assume evil motives where there might be fear or desperation,
Wow.
or simply just a different way of seeing the world.
Yeah, you're right. It's a trap that we always need to be on guard against.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the most important lessons we can take away from this whole deep dive into the world of the Witchfinder General.
Yeah.
That the line between good and evil isn't always as clear as we might like to believe.
Right.
And that even those who commit terrible acts can be products of their circumstances,
Yes.
shaped by forces beyond their control.
Of course, that's not to excuse their actions.
Right.
But it does invite us to consider the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Those societal and psychological factors that can lead to such tragedies.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
What does this all mean for us today?
Yeah, that's the question.
For me, it's a call to action.
Okay.
You know, a call to be more critical of the information we consume,
Right.
to resist the temptation to just scapegoat and demonize,
Yeah.
and to speak out against injustice whenever we see it.
And to remember that history isn't just a collection of dusty facts and figures.
Right.
It's a living tapestry woven from the threads of human experience, both the triumphant and the tragic.
Okay.
And by engaging with these stories, by wrestling with their complexities,
Right.
we can gain valuable insights into ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. If this deep dive has piqued your interest in this really dark chapter of history, I highly recommend checking out Joanna Carrick's play, The Ungodly. It's a great play.
It's a powerful and thought-provoking work that will stay with you long after the curtain falls.
And it just might inspire you to take a closer look at your own beliefs and biases.
And to remember that the fight against fear, ignorance, and prejudice is a battle that must be fought anew in every generation.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of 17th century England.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.